Welcome everyone to another webinar series presented by TropWATER, James Cook University in Australia. Today we're here to talk about a very significant international report on the global assessment of dugong status and conservation needs. So this is a very significant report produced through the management of the conservation of migratory species of wild animals, led by more than 70 authors have contributed to writing this report. We have several of the key coordinators today, including distinguished Professor Helene Marsh, who led the coordination team that produced the report. And we'll have a series of questions, and the panelists will be able to talk as well through the day, and a question session at the end. I'll just start by acknowledging the country and the traditional owners upon the land in which we're having this webinar. No doubt people are coming from all over Australia and international to listen to this webinar. And so I just pay respects to the elders past and present and emerging leaders for the traditional lands that we're on. Should note this session is being recorded and it will be available shortly afterwards on the TropWATER website. The web link for that will be placed in the chat function of this webinar. We will have an open Q&A session at the end of the session. And we encourage you to use the chat function to put your questions in. We will have a staff member monitoring the chat function to keep an eye on the questions. And at the end, if you want to ask a question during the Q&A session at the end, you'll be invited to unmute. And details for how to do that, it's pretty simple. You just do the raise your hand function and a moderator will unmute you so you can ask that question. Details about how to do that will be provided in the chat as well. And we'll also have a web link to the report in the chat as well, and also a link to the 5-minute YouTube summary, a YouTube video summary provided by Professor Len Marsh. And I'll just also mention that at the end of the session, we'll be directed to a really quick survey, online survey. Really appreciate it if you could fill that survey out. The feedback really does help us to improve the quality of these sessions and webinars in the future. So without any further housekeeping, I'll hand it over to the lead coordinator of this report, distinguished Professor Helene Marsh, to give us an overview of the report's findings.
Thanks, Damien. I'll share my screen. Has that worked? Okay, thank you. So, as Damien said, this report looks at the dugong status and conservation needs across their entire global range. It's a big report, 350 pages, and it contains 11 chapters. 9 of them are regional chapters, and they're bookended by an introductory chapter which summarises what we know about dugongs that are relevant to the report, and then there's a final chapter which summarises the key learnings. So, as Damien said, we had more than 70 regional and technical experts combined to produce the report, and most of them donated their time. We had funding from the United Nations Environment Programme, the Convention for Migratory Species, the United Arab Emirates and the Australian Government, and in-kind support from James Cook University's TropWATER Centre, thanks Damien, and 3 of the experts who contributed to the report joining me on the panel today. I'd also like to acknowledge, like Damien, the traditional owners of the people whose land on which we stand to deliver this webinar, but also the traditional owners of all the lands that, coastal lands that support dugongs in Australia. So the blue bits on the map represent the range of the dugongs. There are more than 40 countries and territories in the dugong's vast range. We don't know exactly how many even now because there are some question marks about dugong status in some countries and whether they still support resident populations of dugongs. These countries span coastal waters of tropical and subtropical maritime nations from East Africa to the Western Pacific Ocean, New Caledonia and Vanuatu. These countries are socioeconomically diverse and include some of the world's richest and most highly developed countries like the Arabian Gulf states, Australia, Singapore and Japan, but also some of the least developed and conflict-affected countries such as Somalia, Sudan and Yemen. Northern Australia, which is estimated to support some 166,000 dugongs, which must be a high proportion of the world's total, has the advantages of being a vast region with very low human population density in one of the world's most highly developed countries. Although the dugong is listed as vulnerable to extinction at a global scale, its status and conservation needs are very uneven, and that might be the most important take-home message from the report. The dugong seems to be secure in most parts of Australia and the Arabian Gulf, but its prospects are precarious in East Africa and East Asia and some of the offshore islands. Since the last report, these 3 dugong populations have been red listed at regional scales by IUCN. Dugongs living in the coastal waters of Eastern Africa, the Nancy Islands of Japan, are now listed as critically endangered, those in the waters of New Caledonia as endangered. The report has identified a further 11 populations, including 3 transboundary populations, as appropriate for assessment for potential IUCN red listing as endangered or critically endangered, to emphasise the imperative for conservation action in these locations. The extent of coastal waters less than 20 metres deep, the blue bits on the map, is an indication of the maximum available habitat for dugongs in an area. Now I want you to look here at this map and this histogram, and you can see that these areas are tiny in some of these places, isolated islands such as Aldabra in the Seychelles, Comoros, Mayotte, Palau, Vanuatu and even Japan, in compared with Australia. In most cases we're talking, less than 1%. Now the green bits are the areas of mapped seagrass, and Len's going to explain these are likely to be far too low. Nonetheless, I think this map, this histogram, shows the vulnerability of dugongs living in isolated islands or groups of islands, and this risk is confirmed by the known extinctions of dugongs in the waters of isolated islands off the east coast of Africa. Dugongs have a lifespan similar to ours and usually bear only 1 calf at a time, and they suckle the calf for several years. Because they're such long-lived, slow-breeding animals, their rate of population change is most sensitive to changes in the survival of adults. And the greatest threats are those that kill adult dugongs. The report confirms that accidental drowning in fishing nets, especially gill nets set by small-scale coastal fishers, is now the biggest threat. This threat is challenging to address in low-income countries where fishers have no social security net and must rely on fishing to feed their families. Habitat loss and degradation, some of it exacerbated by fishing because seagrass gets caught in some sorts of nets, particularly seine netting, and coastal development and extreme weather events are increasing threats throughout much of their range. When dugongs can't get enough to eat, they starve and die or move to nearby seagrass beds if they're available, which of course they may not be for animals in waters of isolated small islands. Because the need for the dugong are so different in different regions, cooperation within regions is vital. And the Dugong MOU, developed under the Convention of Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, is key to facilitating further regional cooperation, including action plans to guide the development and delivery of practical and resource-efficient conservation strategies for dugongs and their habitat. And I hope that this report will guide these activities, as the panel will explain. Thank you. So we have Luisa Schramm, Len McKenzie, who's a seagrass expert. Luisa was one of the co-editors of the report and wrote the first draft of several regional chapters. Len is the only person other than me that contributed to every single chapter of the report. And here's Abdelmenam, Mohamed, who is the officer in charge of the Dugong MOU Secretariat, joining us from Abu Dhabi. So I think I'm going to take over from Damien temporarily, if that's okay. And Abdelmenam, with the dugongs range spanning 40 countries, and dugong conservation is certainly an international concern, what do you think the report shows about cooperation with and across regions, and how it is at the moment and how it might be improved? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Helene. I hope you can hear me. Okay, great. So good morning from Abu Dhabi, everyone. Thank you for this great opportunity and for organizing this very important webinar. First of all, I would like to thank the University of James Cook University for organizing this important webinar, and also for me to for the opportunity to reflect on the importance of this report as the coordinator of the Dugong MOU. I would like also to acknowledge the government of Australia for the invaluable support, along with James Cook University for the in-kind contribution, including the support to developing this report. As a brief background about the Convention on Migratory Species, and particularly the Memorandum of Understanding for Dugong and their habitat management throughout their range, it is an illegally binding agreement under the Convention on Migratory Species, and the goal is to promote internationally coordinated action to conserve and to help in the survival of the dugong and seagrass habitat across their range. Right now, the Dugong MOU, we have 27 signatory states out of 46 range states, providing the cooperative platform for government, expert organization, and the secretariat is based here in Abu Dhabi, hosted by the government of UAE through the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi. Now, back to your question, Helene. So, with the range of spanning more than 40 countries and territories, dugong conservation cannot be achieved by any single nation alone. So, it depends on strong international and regional cooperation. The global assessment shows that while many regions have made notable national efforts, for example, in Australia, the Arabian Gulf, parts of the Indian Ocean region, Western Indian Ocean, cross-border collaboration remains uneven, as Helen Marsh mentioned. So in several areas, especially where dugongs move between neighboring waters, cooperation is still constrained by data gaps, inconsistent protection measures, and different priorities. At the same time, there are encouraging examples in Western Indian Ocean, Mozambique, for example, Tanzania, Kenya, are increasingly coordinating monitoring efforts. Also in the Arabian Gulf, CMS is partnering now with ROBI, this is a regional organization for the protection of marine environments in the region, to establish a common baseline or a knowledge among its 8 member states. And in South Asia, we are also implementing a project called the IKI Seagrass Ecosystem Service Project, fostering collaboration among 6 countries to protect seagrass meadows, the primary dugong habitat. At the global level, CMS Dugong MOU provides a neutral platform for range states to share lessons, coordinate research, and align policies responses, especially on key threats such as habitat loss and bycatch. Ultimately, the report underscores the dugong conservation progress is strongest where regional cooperation exists, because dugong do not recognize political boundaries. So strengthening these regional frameworks, sharing data, and aligning national efforts will be vital for maintaining viable dugong population across their range. In short, the report calls for connecting isolated national efforts into coherent regional strategies. That is exactly where the Dugong MOU adds its great value. Thank you.
Thanks you very much, Abdelmenam. Yes, it certainly is there's a lot of countries involved here. So maybe bring Helene in to help answer. So what do all the social and geographic differences across the Dugong's range mean for its conservation and management?
I think geography and socioeconomic status mean a lot. As I explained in my introduction, if we take all, this huge range, it's incredibly socioeconomically and geographically diverse. We've got some of the world's richest countries, the Arabian states, Australia, Singapore, Japan, and some of the most poverty-stricken and conflict-ridden, such as, places like Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. Most of the African nations are very low-income countries. Many of the Asian nations are low to medium-income countries with very high human population densities, particularly along the coast. And it's very, very difficult to deal with fishing impacts in these countries. As I said, fishers have to feed their families. There's no social security safety net. It would be impossible for governments to buy out gill netters, as government has done in the Great Barrier Reef region in Australia. So the largest populations now are in the waters of rich countries such as Australia and the countries around the Arabian Gulf. These countries can afford to implement conservation based on good scientific information. Northern Australia, which supports a very high proportion of the world's dugongs, has multiple advantages. It's a vast region, there are very few people, and it's in a highly developed and stable country. That's a very, very different situation from many other countries. Dugong conservation can't be a priority in countries racked by war. For example, and this has I think, major implications actually for cross-regional, interregional cooperation. For example, in the Red Sea, there's dugong research informing conservation in Saudi Arabia and Egyptian waters, but it's likely to be impossible to have a coordinated Red Sea cooperation in the present geopolitical situation. Earlier this year, Len and I were on the Andaman coast of Thailand, where there was an extensive seagrass dieback leading to dugong deaths. We knew from Australia that some dugongs move when they don't have enough to eat, and we wondered if some animals had moved across the border to Myanmar. In war-torn Myanmar, it was impossible to find out. Of course, being a high-income country isn't a guarantee that dugongs will be conserved. Dugongs are close to extinction in Japan. Admittedly, as I explained in the introduction, there's limited habitat, and dugong populations would never have been large, and they were decimated in earlier last century and this century by hunting. But Japanese fisheries law makes it impossible to control fishing impacts, and there certainly isn't the political will at this stage in Japan to change that. So, Damien, it's a very complicated picture, and I think that any global conservation initiatives have to acknowledge this diversity.
You wouldn't say, Helene, that there are any particular commonalities that each area has quite different issues that they need to manage?
I would say that, and I think regional planning is really, really important, and I think we'll talk a bit more about that later, because gill netting is a problem. Fishing impacts in most places outside Australia, I'd say everywhere, and in parts of Australia it has been a problem. But I think the impacts of coastal development are very different in different places, particularly places with very high levels of population human population density. I also think that it would be good for the major dugong hotspots in the world to do climate vulnerability studies, because I think that the impacts of sea level rise, extreme weather events, etc., are likely to be spatially very variable, and we really haven't quantified that.
Do we have a good understanding of, for the relevant management authorities in all these countries across the dugong range, do they have a good understanding of the status of dugong in their areas? Or is that what this report will do?
Well, we hope this report will do that, because I think there are 27 signatory states to the MOU, and they have meetings and called MOSs, and sometimes some of the other member states come, and these matters can be discussed. So I think the Dugong MOU is a really important vehicle for that sort of exchange of information.
Yep. Thank you. That probably segues onto a question for Luisa there, that we've got the last major report for global report for dugongs was in 2002, so more than 20 years ago. So how has dugong knowledge and research progressed in that 20-year period?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess what the report shows is a tremendous growth in that research effort. Just as a quick metric, there's over 1,000 references throughout the report, which reflects the 20 years of that expanded, not only ecological, but also, genetic information, cultural and conservation research as well. So because of that, we have a much stronger understanding of distribution, abundance and trends, with multiple regions now having repeat surveys, which is super vital. Also, a lot of regions participating in seagrass monitoring and drone-based assessments, as well as that fisher knowledge integration. There's also the 11 important marine mammal area designations that have come about, and they're super important moving forward with dugong conservation. I guess a few quick examples of some major research progress would be in the Arabian Gulf, certainly the identification of that transboundary habitat cause between those countries, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, to inform that regional MPA planning. Again, we'll probably touch on that a bit later, I think Helene mentioned. In India, they're doing a lot of seagrass work with the Wildlife Institute of India and other state forest departments, as well as growing that community-based monitoring and fish interview program, which fills long-standing knowledge gaps there. I could probably mention a few more, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just quickly mention East Africa, in particular Mozambique, with the IUCN listing, as well as a high extinction risk being recognized, has been really, really vital in conservation efforts there. Despite all of this amazing progress and research work, there are still, I think, some key knowledge gaps that remain, which I think we might discuss a bit later. I'll just leave it there in the interest of time.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Luisa. Yeah, well, speaking on our knowledge base, we might also consider seagrass. Seagrass, of course, is closely tied to the distribution extent of seagrass, is closely tied to the dugong's extent and health. And we had Len McKenzie online, the seagrass expert who contributed to all the chapters. So Len was able to give us a good overview of what does the report show about seagrass health and distribution across Dugong's range.
Thanks, Damien. Yeah, I suppose this report is very different to the last report. And very early on, I had discussions with Helene about, there really needs to be a bit more detail about seagrass in that. So I suppose I sort of dobbed myself in for that job. And certainly, as you know, dugongs are seagrass community specialists, and a dugong can eat around about 28 to 40 kilograms of seagrass in a day. So it's a pretty fair-sized meal. And dugongs aren't terribly fussy about seagrass. They'll feed on most of the 26 species that we find throughout the range. And when we look at seagrass throughout the dugong range, we find that it can grow to depths of more than 70 meters in clear waters. But the deepest we have a record of dugongs feeding on seagrass is around about 33 meters, and that's from the GBR. So when we discussed about how we look at seagrass in this document, Helene and I decided that it's probably best that we focus in that area where most dugongs are, which is at water depth of less than about 20 meters. And so that's when we did this review. It's primarily focused on seagrass shallower than 20 meters. So to conduct the review, and what we did was we pulled together all the published and publicly available maps on seagrass, and that was up until December 2023. So there has been some newer information that's come along since then, but this was focused up until 2023. And we really only included information on seagrass which was mapped to moderate or high confidence within those dugong range states. So the result from that is we identified that there is, at least around 41,000 square kilometres of seagrass in waters shallower than 20 metres depth. But like Helene said, we do firmly believe this is a fairly big underestimate of what's really out there. But what we did find in this report is most of the seagrass, so about 60% of the seagrass that's been mapped has really been mapped in Northern Australia. So that goes from Shark Bay on the west to Port Stephens on the east coast. So that's a huge amount of seagrass within Australia's waters. And that was next followed by places like East Africa, where about 12% of the seagrass within the range had been mapped. That was then followed by Maritime Southeast Asia with 10%, and the Arabian Gulf, which we understand holds the second largest population of dugong, was about 9%. So, there's large areas of seagrass that are occurring in places like East Africa and Southeast Asia, which, we would think that there should be a lot more dugong out there. Certainly, it would indicate there's plenty of seagrass for the dugongs, so then that starts bringing up those issues like Helene raised earlier about the social issues and the threats that are going on there. The other interesting thing we noticed is that when we started looking at seagrass in that water depth is when you've got waters down to about 20 metres, you should be able to find seagrass at around about 10 to 20% of that area. So, you know, places where there's been good mapping, there actually is quite significant seagrass. And the most extensive seagrass meadows we found were really, or they were reported, were really within those shallow and very sheltered waters, which you generally find on like a continental shelf, which is protected by something like a reef, for example, the Great Barrier Reef, and places like the Torres Strait, or within large Gulf areas. So, you know, that's where we're going to find most of our seagrass. So we think there's a lot of gaps out there which have yet to be explored. And yeah, for the sake of time, we might get to that later on.
Well, actually, I wouldn't mind just exploring that just for the moment. Actually, Len, what are the gaps that you see with the seagrass? Yeah, because there's a lot of information on the mapping that's been done, but maybe just a bit more commentary on some of the gaps.
So some of the largest knowledge gaps we have is places like continental Southeast Asia. And as Helene mentioned, Myanmar is certainly somewhere where, you know, it's 0.1% of their water shallower than 20 metres is where they've found seagrass. We expect there's probably a lot more there, but just at this stage, no one has actually looked. Also, areas like the Red Sea, less than 1% of their waters has seagrass. So, I mean, you know, we think there's possibly a lot more there, and certainly more recent sorts of mapping that's occurring within the Red Sea has indicated there is a lot more seagrass, particularly around the Saudi Arabian side. And also in that maritime Southeast Asia. I mean, that is a very complex coastline. It has only reported about, you know, less than 1% of its shallower areas with seagrass. But the good news there is some newer mapping which is currently underway and hopefully should be released in the next month or so, which shows that, you know, the new maps of seagrass are, you know, that there's probably 2 to 3 times as much seagrass there than what we think there is. So, yeah, there's some very large knowledge gaps out there which, you know, hopefully can be filled. Yeah,
great. Thanks, Len. I just want to move on to back to Helene. And yeah, Helene's studied dugongs your whole career, Helene. And this report is a huge amount of information in this report. So what actually surprised you? What findings from the report gave you surprise?
Well, the biggest surprise I got was how a combination of circumstances, which you might describe as luck, can influence a conservation status in a region. I mean, I think about Australia as a lucky country because it's a large area, not many people, rich country, stable, all those things. But what I was really surprised about was that luck can assist dugong conservation in low-income countries too. We heard that dugong populations are not in a good state on the coast of East Africa, but there is a bright spot in what's called the Bazarutu seascape in Mozambique. And Mozambique is one of the poorest countries in the world. And when I asked Evan Trotsuk, who is one of the co-authors of the report, and I said, Evan, why is the Bazarutu state so special? Why is it different? And he emailed me back and he said, Helene, it's about luck. And I was very surprised by what he said, and so we followed it up with a Zoom conversation, and then there's a box in the report. And he said, well, look, dugongs were never culturally particularly important in this area, so they weren't hunted. And the sea snake includes a very large national park and an adjacent wildlife sanctuary. It has clear water and beautiful white sandy beaches. I've been there, it's stunning. And it's an important international tourist destination. Even though artisanal fisheries are very important, because there's upwelling on that coast, it's mainly not gill netting which is so lethal for dugongs. It's mainly seine netting, and this has enabled the government to prohibit gill netting, and it's illegal in Mozambique to leave any type of fishing gear unattended, which is very unusual. But in 2017, the Mozambique government entered into a 25-year co-management arrangement with African Parks. And African Parks runs a whole lot of parks in Africa, but this is their only marine park. And 16% of the income from tourism goes back to the local communities for development projects which have widespread benefit. So African Parks has this a long-standing practice of conservation programs based on good science. And in fact, I'd say national parks in Africa have this tradition which doesn't exist in a lot of other places. And so there've been very well designed surveys of the region for dugongs for many years, and now they're collaborating with Chris Klager and his team at JCU on a huge satellite tracking program using the latest technology. This would be unheard of in most other low-income countries. So this very unusual situation for a low-income country has really been enabled by a unique combination of circumstances, which Evan puts down to luck.
Well, thank you, Len. I'm glad you raised that, because that was when I first heard that too. I thought, oh, Mozambique, right? They've got a big dugong population, or healthy population. So that was a surprise to me too. So I'm glad you mentioned that one. And congratulations to them on the work they are doing. You're right, that satellite tracking they're doing is something that even here in Australia we're envious of.
Yes, indeed.
I might just ask a question of Luisa. Luisa's doing a lot of work with Indigenous communities in Australia who have strong cultural connections to dugongs. So Luisa, from your perspective, what are some of the cultural values of the dugongs and how we might incorporate those into dugong conservation planning?
Yeah, that's a huge question, Damien.
Yeah.
And I guess for this one, I think it's important that I acknowledge that I'm not an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. I'm an Aussie-born Tongan woman, so I'll only speak about my opinion and my personal experiences surrounding this. I guess in the Australian context, I just want to mention the depth and sophistication of Indigenous relationships with sea country as a whole, not necessarily just dugongs. These are worldviews that encompass ecological, spiritual, kinship, and resource-based understandings, which have been passed down for thousands of years, many generations. In Australia, I guess where dugongs do occur here, they're often really central to those worldviews, not just as a species, but as a really vital part of country, something that connects people, place, and story. And, our traditional owners here often hold really highly detailed place-based knowledge of dugong distribution, feeding grounds, seasonal movements, calving areas, and long-term changes to these areas, which is knowledge that Western science can't generate alone, and they're very key for conservation of dugongs. But also beyond those ecological insights, dugongs carry really profound cultural significance, more spiritual significance, I suppose. They're embedded in creation stories, ceremony, and as indicators of the health of country. And for many of these communities, they're part of that wider kinship system, which are often looked at as respected relatives, whose well-being reflects the people, not just the country. You hear healthy country, healthy people, and that's certainly true in the case of the dugong. And it's hard because these values and this connection is often expressed in ways that can't be really translated in a Western context or framework or even language, even in English. So it's really hard to try and convey the depth of that connection and the value of that connection. However, I guess strengthening conservation really comes down to complementing those Indigenous knowledges with the Western science that we have and that we can create in the future. Just thinking quickly on contemporary movement data, like we have genetics, which really paint a very important picture for the recent past of dugong movements, but we're really missing that contemporary movement data, which is often answered with GPS satellite tracking, which can be logistically challenging, and especially in remote areas, which, as Helene mentioned, in Australia, the whole dugong range is very near remote. So that can be really hard, and Indigenous knowledges can really answer those questions and help strengthen conservation measures that way. I think cultural values should also be a criterion for protected areas. So Western science is usually prioritizing biodiversity and population metrics, but cultural values should be up there in their own right. And areas where dugongs are central to that community identity or ceremony or kinship, that should warrant formal protection, even if the Western science alone doesn't classify them as a critical habitat yet anyway. It's really important to support our First Nations peoples to manage and care for their country as they would with their knowledges and their practices. And I think that's really essential for achieving conservation outcomes that are culturally and ecologically meaningful, especially in Australia.
Well, Luisa, in compiling this report across all those countries, how would you say that the understanding of the cultural connection to Indigenous people is how well is understood and how well that is incorporated into management?
Not very
No doubt it
well, if
varies
I'm
a
being
lot.
honest.
Not very well. Okay.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, in Australia, it's probably the best case so far. There's still so much work to be done, but internationally, yeah, it's not very well understood or documented or implemented at all. Yeah.
Okay.
At all.
Yeah. It's good. That's obviously clearly an area where we could actually improve dugong management and conservation.
Yeah, absolutely. And also mentioning, like Helene mentioned about Mozambique with the case of cultural significance, it just varies, you know, and it
Yes.
could be not integrated into management because it's not as culturally significant, so to speak. But I think, yeah, there are lots of places where that's lacking for sure.
Speaking of managing across the full international range of dugong, we've been talking about the dugong as a species, but of course the report does highlight as well that there are potentially distinct subpopulations of endangered dugongs. And that's an important finding in the report as well. So I don't know if maybe Helene might want to lead off on explaining the significance of these distinct subpopulations.
Thanks, Damien. Well, the areas that we've identified as subpopulations that could be thought about separately for management, have different conservation status, have so far largely been identified on the basis of geography, and each is going to need its own management plan. But I think one of the areas in the report where there has been major advances since the previous report is about understanding the genetics, but there's also a lot more to do, and some of the new developments, for example, that Eva Paulus is using genomics, might turn what I'm about to say on its head. But let's stick with what we know at the moment. So David Blair, who wrote the genetics section of the report, reanalysed mitochondrial sequences from more than 900 dugongs, and he identified 4 main groups. But it's really clear there's very limited material for much of the range, particularly in Asia. So David thinks that dugongs in the Australian region, and especially Northern Australia, can probably be regarded as genetically healthy, and they should be in a good position to respond to changing environmental pressures, or at least a better position than in some other areas. But at the moment, it looks like, based on mitochondrial DNA only, it looks like diversity in the Western Indian Ocean, Palau and New Caledonia is quite low. and probably indicative of recent founding events. And if there is low nuclear diversity in these populations, their long-term resilience might be a lot less than in Australian dugongs. But probably more worrying is there's this huge area, particularly in maritime Southeast Asia, where we just don't know or know very little. So I think that this lack of data restricts our ability to define the geographical extent of genetically connected populations and the appropriate size of management units. In Australia, there's increasing evidence of genetic structure along the Australian coast, but we don't know what that really means for conservation. And some of the very interesting work done by Robert Cope at the University of Queensland, and he found that gene-tagged dugongs move between Moreton Bay and Hervey Bay, which is a couple of 100 kilometres, much more than the genetic structure indicated. So are dugongs just not moving and breeding? And we know from our aerial surveys that some dugongs move after large-scale seagrass loss when they also stop breeding. So I think at this point in time, and I think this is a really important going forward, we don't know what the appropriate scale of management should be and what other factors need to be considered. And I think that applies everywhere in the dugong range, but particularly in the areas outside Australia, and particularly in, there's really key areas in maritime Southeast Asia, Indonesia and the Philippines that not only do we know far too little about seagrass, but we know far too little about dugong genetics and how the populations or in different locations might be linked up.
Yes, thanks, Helene. It does seem like an area that's really important for us to get a better handle on the connectivity between those populations and their ability to help each other recover. Certainly an important area of research. I just want to maybe throw for our final question back to Abdelmenam. With this report highlights a lot of information that we do know, and a lot of information about recommendations of what needs to be done next. So how is the Dugong MRU Secretariat planning on turning the findings from this report into action?
Thanks, Damien. This is a very important question. And for us, this report, it's like a roadmap, for moving forward. I joined the Secretariat 1.5 years back, and I was trying to collect all the information so that I have a clear picture about the priorities. And this report, for me, is like a guiding document for moving forward and for the Secretariat as a whole. And as next steps for us, we think that there are 3 areas where we should be focusing in the future. First area is outreach. Second area is knowledge, and the third area is policy. So on the outreach, we are developing right now outreach strategy to promote the report findings at the global level. In fact, this webinar marks our first official outreach activity since the report's launch during the IUCN World Conservation Congress last October in Abu Dhabi. We plan to replicate similar webinars, sessions in other regions as well. We are also encouraged to see proactive NGOs who contributed to the development of the report from Japan and China. They started already translating the chapters related to China and Japan to their own languages, and they issued proactively a press release immediately after the launch of the report in Abu Dhabi. So proactively doing a lot of promoting the report findings and putting pressure on the government to move and to support the dugong conservation these two countries particularly. There are other examples, but on the sake of the time, I just mentioned these two good examples. The first example, from Japan is a center called the Save the Dugong Campaign Center in Japan, very active NGO. And in China, we have China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation. This is another very, very active NGO supporting the dugong conservation. On the second point related to knowledge and data, the assessment highlighted, as also the panelists mentioned, information gaps, especially in East Africa, South Asia, and the Pacific. And so we hope to fill these gaps through collaboration with regional entities and national entity as well, partners as well, to develop innovative initiatives. I think the technology, as mentioned by Helene, is very important to capitalize on the AI and spotting and all these platforms to help getting more data and information about combining community engagement and modern technology. So we are developing an initiative that rely on AI, but also citizen science. So that we hope this will be a very important initiative to help fill the data. In the region here, we are collaborating with ROGMI. This, as I mentioned, is a regional organization here in the region that covers 8 countries. And we are working on producing a baseline for 8 countries in this region so that we address the data and knowledge gap in this region as a model. The last point, the third point, is the policy and coordination. And as we mentioned in the beginning, we have every 3 years a meeting of the signatory. We call it the MOS, and the next one will be in 2026. And we hope that the findings of this report will inform discussion, will inform updating and amending the existing conservation and management plan that we have. This is our, let's say, operational document that help us in implementing the initiative that we have. So this conservation and management plan will be informed by the finding of the latest report and hope to help us in addressing all the issues identified in the report. Finally, the report reminds us about the dugong conservation is inseparable from healthy seagrass ecosystem. That's why we are ensuring that dugongs and seagrass features more prominently in global conservation agendas. And for example, through the 2030 seagrass breakthrough that CMS supports together with UN Climate Champion and IUCN, we hope to put the seagrass agenda high in the global agenda. So with that, I hope I answered your question, David. Thank you.
Very, very well, thanks, Abdelmenam. And I think that actually we did have a question from on the chat as well about what were the next steps, but I think you've covered that very well.
Thank you.
We're just about out of time. I do open it to the floor. If any of the attendees want to raise their hand, we can unmute you, and if you want to ask a question. In the meantime, I'll just ask, it could be for Abdelmenam as well. I presume seagrass will be as important. The management and conservation of seagrass will feature in the next steps as well, not just dugong.
Absolutely, and that's what we are doing through the 2030 seagrass breakthrough. This is an initiative that we announced during the COP28 in Dubai, and since then we are actively working with partners, with experts, and we organizing regional workshops. For instance, we started with a regional workshop for Southeast Asia in Bangkok last February. Len McKenzie was there, and all the global experts were there, and we discussed the issues of seagrass conservation in that region. Then we moved to the Arabian region, We organized in April regional workshop here for the Arabian region, again attended by global experts. We shared the knowledge and the gaps for this region, particularly related to seagrass science. And then we moved to Mombasa, to Kenya, where we had in last October, again, another symposium related to the seagrass conservation. So we are quite active at the regional level.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess just following on from that question, maybe Len could quickly comment on actions for seagrass recovery being done by communities in those countries. What sort of activities are already happening in regards to increasing the amount of seagrass habitat available?
Well, before we all start rushing out and restoring seagrass, we need to actually find out where seagrass is and meld that up with information on where it was. So that's why seagrass mapping really is a priority, and technology is going to help us fill these gaps. So, technology's changed hugely in terms of seagrass mapping over the past decade. In 2015, we saw the launch of satellites, which can capture images with significantly higher resolution, greater frequency than ever before. We now have UAVs, drones, so it makes image capture more accessible and more cost effective in these regions. And on top of that, in 2022, AI woke up, and it's enabled huge advances in image processing and map creation and modeling. So tapping into all those sort of things, we're now working much more closely with communities so that we can get much better in situ reference data. We can plug it into these models more efficiently. And we can produce maps with much greater confidence. And certainly these new approaches, in the next months and couple of years, we're going to see some huge advances in mapping seagrass. And you'll start seeing large regional maps of seagrass coming out very, very soon. You'll start seeing some global maps start coming out as well. So, and this also, is aided by things such as the seagrass breakthrough. Because without these maps, which underpin the goals of protecting and accelerating restoration, you won't be able to move very well forward. So I think it's exciting times ahead, and working closely with communities, I think this is all very much achievable.
Oh, thanks, Len. That's great. There was a question in the chat about how research, new technologies and success can be utilised to improve monitoring across the regions of Dugong's range. I think you've given a good answer to that for seagrass. I might maybe invite Helene to comment on the same sorts of technologies for monitoring dugongs. Len sort of painted a picture there where we can collect information at large scale using these new technologies, AI and remote sensing, etc. What about the monitoring technologies for dugong, Helene?
Well, I think a very interesting question about monitoring dugongs. Again, it depends. The right way of doing it depends a lot on geography. I mean, it may be that we can monitor dugongs from satellites eventually, but I think that's a way off. I don't mean satellite tagged dugongs, I mean visually. Because of the challenges associated with water turbidity and pixel size, etc. That may happen. But at the moment, obviously, small drones are revolutionising monitoring, but often they operate at relatively local spatial scales. So I think that there's, particularly in places like Indonesia, where it's not going to be like the situation in Australia, where we have, vast areas that you can do large-scale surveys with aircraft or drones. I mean, and use AI or whatever. The principles are the same. But I think the big challenge is going to be in much more fragmented habitats. And I think there's going to be a combination there of organising very good monitoring, understanding the distribution of seagrass, that'll be absolutely critical, then actually using a combination of probably small drones and environmental DNA. I think there's a lot of future there, but really, really understanding You know, the more you know about habitat, the more you can design good survey techniques for animals, and that's one of the reasons I'm so keen on seeing increased effort, and Len's saying it's going to happen in terms of seagrass, because I think the more we know about that, the better we can design survey techniques for dugongs, taking advantage of the advances in technology, but fundamentally, you know, you have to have good survey design.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank the panelists for their time today. The report is a global assessment of dugong status and conservation needs. It's available through the links in the chat and the TropWATER website and the Convention of Migratory Species as well. I want to thank there was over 70 authors contributed to it, but the panelists you see online today put an extraordinary amount of work in over several years to get it done. And congratulations to them. It is a very significant time that should set us up for improved dugong management for years to come. Thank you very much, everyone.